Hi class, welcome to lecture 2, part B. We're going to continue our discussion on realism. However, now we're going to focus on neorealism, where in part A, we focused more on classical liberalism. So neorealism is similar to classic realism in the sense that it believes the international system is anarchic, everyone for themselves. But where classical realism focuses more on the actual units in the international system, states, countries, neorealism focuses more on the structure itself. So it says that actors are actually just reacting to the international system and the changes of power in the international system. They're not so much controlling the system as the system is controlling them, because they're reactionary to the system. So classical realism would say that states rise and fall in power on the merit of their decision making internationally, whereas neorealism says, no, they're just reacting to changes in this actual system. So classical realism puts more emphasis on the actor. Neorealism puts more emphasis on the system itself. So we're going to talk about a few different neorealist type thinkers, starting with Kenneth Waltz, who passed away, almost 10 years ago now in 2013. Very brilliant guy. And many call him the so-called founder of neorealism. He says that states balance against threats of power. And this seems to be true, right? We've seen this. We talked about World War II. We've talked about, Napoleon, et cetera. All these bids to take over Europe have generally been stopped by a collection of geographical powers in that area. He says that change in the international system occurs when you have these power shifts. And you can balance this power, right? You can, again, going back to our example of World War II, you saw the Allies balance against the Axis power. You can do that and try to prevent war, right? Saying like with threats, saying that if you attack us, we're going to go all out with our allies and try to destroy you. He says you can do that. Balanced power is real, but he concedes that sometimes war is inevitable. So when would war maybe be inevitable? Maybe when you get that type of leader like a Hitler who perhaps doesn't act rationally. But we'll talk more about that later. He does agree with the tenets of classical liberalism in that there is no overarching international power. And he also states that you can never be certain of the intentions of other states. You never know what another country is going to do. And if you presume that you do, you're going to get in trouble, because they might act in ways that we consider irrational, and vice versa. Waltz says that peace is more likely in a bipolar system because, again, he thinks conflicts comes from changes of power in the international system. So he thinks conflict comes when one state becomes very powerful or a very powerful state becomes very weak. This shift creates conflict between countries. So he thinks that there's more stability when there's two roughly equal power. So an example of this, of course, would be the Cold War, right? You have the United States and you have the USSR. And was that a relatively peaceful time? I'd say it was, right? I mean, the whole world thought we were going to, at any minute, have a huge nuclear war, but it never happened. And, while that might have been fragile, it was a relatively peaceful time. So he would say that bipolar system can indeed promote peace. Our next neorealist thinker we're going to talk about is John Mearsheimer, who's actually still alive. He's been around for quite a while. Quote I like from him: in an ideal world where there are only good states, power would be largely irrelevant. So he's basically saying, in a perfect world, if there's only good actors, we wouldn't need power. But clearly he's kind of tongue-in-cheek saying, there's not only good states, you're always going to need power. So he's very similar to Waltz. He kind of expands on Waltz's thoughts, but he says that there is a problem with excessive power. So Waltz talked about a bipolar system, and he's kind of extending on that. He's saying that if one state becomes way too powerful, it provokes balancing, which we've talked about in the beginning of lecture 1A. You're going to see if one country becomes really powerful, lesser nations are going to start teaming up just in case that larger, stronger nation decides to push its power, right? Like kind of a World War II Germany type situation. So he says regional hegemons, hegemon being the controlling power, are possible but global hegemons can provoke danger, right? And a powerful state should seek to actively prevent global hegemons or even regional hegemons that might challenge its powers, okay? So he calls that offensive hegemony. So he would recommend that if you're a strong state, a strong regional state, that any challenge of power you see pop up, you should immediately deal with your power, just in case it grows or evolves into something that can challenge your power. So offensive hegemony, kind of a scary type of principle. But again, when we're talking about realism, it's not always necessarily compatible with what we would call morality. Okay, so now that we've talked about classical and neorealism, I'm going to go through some of the criticisms of realism. And I'm interested to see what you guys think about this, because there are holes in all international theories, right? In all types of theories, there's going to be some kind of problems. And to be honest with you guys, no one theory, whether it be realism or liberalism or Marxism, no one theory perfectly describes the international system. Really, I would say the best way to look at it is to take the good parts from all theories and kind of cobble them together. So here's one, I think, a fair criticism of realism. And this really goes back to kind of Mearsheimer, right? He says, the criticism is, if states balance against more powerful states, that's a concept of realism, right? Smaller states balancing against more powerful states. Why have other countries not balanced against the United States? The United States is the strongest power to probably ever exist on this planet. Why have we not seen smaller, weaker nations, maybe European nations, Asian nations, team up to try to counteract the power of the US, right? It really hasn't happened. And we might say we've reached a time in history where that's not really relevant anymore. With globalization, international trade, we're very economically reliant on each other. So maybe it's not in the best interest of those states to balance. But either way, no matter how you look at it, I think that's a gaping hole in realist thought. 2, realism ignores the influence of non-governmental entities, or NGOs, non-governmental organizations, individuals, multinational corporations. I think this is becoming more and more true every day. In 2021, we've seen some companies just become so large. If you look at things like Amazon, Apple, whatever these huge companies are, they definitely have influence on government. And if you have influence on government, you have influence theoretically on the international system. So realism doesn't really account for that. And I think, as we, it's always dangerous to make predictions in political science. I think the further we go, the more and more power you're going to see these multinational corporations have. So that'll be interesting to see where that goes in the future. And 3 has an extremely pessimistic worldview. It's kind of a simple criticism, but essentially some people look at realism and say, you're inviting war because of your pessimistic view. You're saying, especially with things like offensive realism, you're essentially saying, go to conflict before there's any conflict to prevent conflict from happening. Right. So some people look at that as kind of war hungry, something like a war hawk. Okay, this could potentially encourage conflict. What would the realist response to that be? They probably say, no, we don't want conflict. That's why we're acting now. Right. We're going to make the decision that's best for our country. Sometimes that's conflict. Sometimes that's not. But that doesn't matter as long as we're protected. And finally, 4. It does not offer a solution to anarchy. So it describes the world as anarchic, but it offers no potential solution. It says, nope, the world's anarchic. You have to deal with it, and that's that. So it's really just kind of a description, not a helpful theory. So that is, I would say, a valid criticism as well. Okay, so we're going to finish up this lecture talking about something called game theory, a very useful theory in political science. Essentially, it's the study of interaction between rational decision-making actors. So, when we look at the international system, we're comparing relationships between countries. Game theory kind of breaks that down to smaller microcosm and plays out scenarios and how actors might react, and therefore we can maybe apply that to the international system, right? So it's just a smaller scale. And perhaps the most famous example of game theory is the prisoner's dilemma. It's very interesting. Essentially, it's saying, in what case would two actors maybe try to act rationally or act rationally, but pick something that is perhaps not rational, okay? So here's the prisoner's dilemma, and I also have a video on it if you're interested. So I'll explain it, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. So the situation is, and again, this is game theory, right? We're taking an example and looking at the data and seeing how we can apply it to the international system. So Anthony and Brittany are both arrested for a crime and taken to separate interrogation rooms, right? You've all seen crime shows. They interrogate you apart, try to get you to flip on the other one, right? So here are the possible results for Anthony and Brittany. One, if they both betray each other, they'll each get 5 years in prison, right? Two, if one betrays the other, so if Anthony betrays Brittany, but Brittany does not betray Anthony, Anthony, the one who snitched, will receive 1 year in prison and Brittany will serve 10, and vice versa. And three, if they both remain silent, both of them will go free, right? So the rational decision here would be to both remain silent. But the problem is you don't know what the other person is saying. And if you don't rat and they do, you're serving 5 years in prison. So, what we're getting at with the prisoner's dilemma is you see here, rational actors make possibly an irrational decision because of the situation at hand. So if you're in the situation, what would your reaction be? Generally, what we're going to probably see with the prisoner's dilemma is they both rat, right? It kind of makes sense because where you're sitting, you say, okay, if I don't rat and she rats me, I'm going to jail for 10 years. If I rat and she doesn't rat, I'm going free. And the worst case scenario is if we both, or if she rats and I don't, then she goes free. So the rational being perhaps in the situation would recommend that you both rat, right? And that still ends up with you 5 years in prison. So you can see how rationality is somewhat complicated, right? What's the rational decision isn't always the one you're going to take because of the circumstances put in front of you. So here's a video on this. I recommend that you watch it. It kind of goes through what we just talked about, but I think it helps to see it visually. So please go ahead and give that a watch. Okay, so we talked about this. That's going to conclude it for lecture 2, part B. Thanks for tuning in, guys, and I will talk to you soon.